It was September 2022, and I, Michael Thompson, had meticulously planned what was meant to be an unforgettable escape, our annual guys' trip. The Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania's coal country beckoned, a rugged stretch perfect for reconnecting with three of my closest friends. We were all seasoned hikers in our 30s, eager to shed the weight of work and family for a few days of pure wilderness camaraderie. I remember one friend voicing his concerns. "I heard that section has some sketchy abandoned mining operations. Maybe we should pick a different route." I brushed his worries aside, confident in my research. "The trail's well maintained," I assured him. "Thousands hike there safely every year." Oh, how profoundly wrong I was. While I won't bore you with the usual planning minutiae, what unfolded in those mountains taught me a chilling truth. Some of the deepest dangers in the wilderness aren't natural. They're deliberately crafted by people who understand exactly how to exploit the best of human nature, our innate desire to help. Our quartet was a familiar one. My college roommate, Jake Williams, my neighbor, Dave Peterson, my brother-in-law, Rick Coleman, and myself. We set out on a Thursday morning, aiming for a brisk 15 miles a day through central Pennsylvania's more remote trails. This area, deeply etched with history, was once a thriving coal region from the 1800s to mid-1900s, leaving a legacy of abandoned operations scattered throughout the mountains. The first 2 days were idyllic. The weather was crisp perfection, the fall foliage a riot of color, and our pace was excellent. We fell into the easy rhythm of old friends, sharing camp duties, laughter around the fire, and talking about everything from office politics to our kids' futures. It was the third day, deep in a particularly isolated section of trail, when a sound sliced through the autumn air, stopping us cold. Human voices, desperate and faint, calling for help. They came from somewhere off trail, deeper in the woods to our east. We strained to listen, making out what sounded like at least two distinct individuals, their cries of "help us" and "please," laced with undeniable distress. Dave, ever the Good Samaritan, immediately wanted to investigate. "We have to help them," he urged, already moving towards the sound. "Someone could be seriously injured." Yet a cold knot of unease formed in my stomach. Something felt profoundly wrong. Our maps showed no marked trails or legitimate camping spots in that direction. The terrain was notoriously rugged, steep ravines, dense forest, a place even experienced hikers would struggle to navigate. Why would anyone be there unless truly lost or grievously hurt? Jake, sharing my apprehension, suggested, "Maybe we should call for help instead of going in there ourselves. If they're that badly injured, they probably need professional rescue." Not four guys with basic first aid, but Rick and Dave were already set on heading towards the calls, and the sheer desperation in those voices was a powerful, almost irresistible pull. Against my better judgment, I followed, with Jake reluctantly bringing up the rear. We plunged off the main trail, battling through thick underbrush. The terrain was every bit as unforgiving as I'd feared. We scrambled over fallen logs, navigated around massive boulders, and pushed through thorny thickets that snagged our clothes and gear. All the while, the voices continued, always seeming to be just a little further ahead, fueling our sense of urgency. After a grueling 20 minutes, we reached the edge of a steep ravine. Peering down, partially concealed by dense overhanging vegetation, was the dark maw of an abandoned mine shaft. The pleas for help were undeniably coming from within. "Hello," Dave shouted down, his voice echoing. "Are you hurt? How many of you are there?" The response was immediate, chillingly so. "Please help us," came a voice from the shadows. "We've been trapped for hours."
"There was a collapse?"
Rick was already scouting for a way down. "We have to get in there," he insisted. "They sound terrified." But Jake grabbed his arm, his expression grim. "Wait," he said, his voice low. "Something about this doesn't feel right. Why would anyone be exploring an abandoned mine here? And look around." He gestured at the area. He was right. The ground near the mine entrance was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded equipment or personal items. None of the telltale signs you'd expect if people had been actively exploring and then gotten trapped. I tried again, calling down into the darkness. "How did you get trapped? Are you injured? How many are with you?" The immediate response came back, but as I listened more closely, a jarring detail struck me. The voices were clear, almost too clear, as if they were right inside the entrance, not muffled by a deep, collapsed tunnel. And their answers were eerily perfect. Exactly what you'd expect from trapped people, yet devoid of any specific, authentic detail that true distress would surely bring. "Let me try something," Jake murmured, cupping his hands around his mouth. "What are your names? Where are you from?" There was a pause then, longer than any previous response. Then, the voices resumed their general pleas for help, completely ignoring Jake's specific questions. It was in that moment, a cold dread washing over me, that the pieces clicked into place. "Those aren't live voices," I stated, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "That's a recording." Dave stared at me, disbelief etched on his face. "What are you talking about?" "Of course they're real. Listen." But now that I was truly focused, I could hear it. A subtle, artificial quality to the voices, a faint background hiss suggesting a speaker system. And then, the most damning evidence of all, the exact same phrases, the same desperate words, repeating in a chilling, deliberate loop every few minutes. "This is a trap," I declared, my voice flat. "Someone has deliberately set up a recording to lure people into that mine shaft." Rick, still grappling with the idea, asked, "Why? What would be the point?" I didn't have an answer then, but every fiber of my being screamed that we needed to leave immediately. Abandoned mines are death traps even in benign circumstances. Toxic gases, unstable structures, deep hidden shafts. But one used as bait? That was a danger beyond imagining. "We're leaving," I announced, my tone brooking no argument. "Right now. We're going back to the trail, and we're reporting this." Dave was still torn, reluctant to abandon what he thought were people in need. But Jake stood by me. "Mike's right," he affirmed, his eyes serious. "This whole situation is wrong. If there are truly people trapped, professionals can handle it. But if it's a trap, we don't want to be around to find out what happens to those who fall for it." As we turned to leave, a new sound, distinct from the looped cries, confirmed my darkest fears. From the woods behind us, not from the mine itself, came the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. Someone was moving through the forest, trying to be stealthy, but not quite succeeding. The footsteps paused when we paused, and resumed when we started moving again. We were being stalked. "Move fast," I whispered urgently to the others. "Don't run, but don't waste a second getting back to the trail." The 20-minute hike back to the Appalachian Trail felt like an eternity. Behind us, the recorded pleas for help continued their chilling loop, while the unseen presence in the woods shadowed our every move. I heard the snap of twigs, the rustle of disturbed leaves, always from a slightly different angle, a silent, predatory game. When we finally broke out onto the main trail, we didn't stop. We hiked towards the nearest road crossing as fast as we could safely manage. No one spoke a word for miles, but I could see the dawning horror in their eyes, mirroring my own, the stark realization of the danger we had so narrowly escaped. At the first opportunity, our phones barely getting service, we contacted the Pennsylvania State Police, recounting our bizarre and terrifying discovery. The trooper who took our initial report sounded understandably skeptical, but he diligently noted every detail and promised an investigation. 2 days later, his follow-up call sent a shiver down my spine that lingers to this day. A search team had indeed located the mine shaft we described, and their findings were horrific, irrefutable evidence that it was a sophisticated trap. The recorded voices were played through a hidden battery-powered speaker system, precisely positioned to lure unsuspecting hikers closer. But the most disturbing discovery was inside the mine itself. The shaft had been deliberately destabilized with strategically placed explosives. Anyone entering would have triggered a collapse, burying them alive with no chance of rescue. The entire macabre setup was designed for murder, made to look like a tragic accident. Near the mine, they also found a temporary campsite, clearly occupied for an extended period. It contained detailed maps of the local trail system, surveillance equipment, and notebooks filled with chilling observations of hikers passing through. Most sickening were the tallies, marks indicating how many people had responded to the recorded pleas and how many had actually entered the mine. According to their evidence, at least 3 groups of hikers had fallen for this death trap in the previous month alone. None had ever been reported missing, suggesting the perpetrator specifically targeted individuals or small groups without tight itineraries, ensuring their disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger search efforts. Despite an extensive investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies, the monster responsible vanished as quickly as their scheme was uncovered. They were never caught. But what truly haunts me, what keeps me awake some nights, are the chilling questions that echo in the vast silence of the wilderness. How many other insidious traps like this might be hidden throughout the immense Appalachian Trail system? How many missing hikers, whose disappearances are attributed to getting lost or injured, were actually victims of meticulously planned murder, designed to look like a tragic accident? The investigator confirmed my fears. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past decade, there had been similar reports. Recordings used to draw hikers into peril, trail markers deliberately rerouted into hazardous zones, campsites booby-trapped to cause accidental injuries or deaths. The wilderness draws those seeking escape from civilization, but tragically, that includes those who seek to escape civilization precisely so they can prey on others without interference. The sheer scale and remoteness of places like the Appalachian Trail make them perfect hunting grounds for human predators who understand that victims can vanish without a trace, and evidence can be easily concealed or destroyed. This experience fundamentally altered how we approach the outdoors. We now carry satellite communication devices, file detailed itineraries with multiple contacts, and have developed a protocol for any situation that feels too convenient or too compelling to be genuine. Most profoundly, we've learned that the most dangerous predators in the wilderness aren't bears or adverse weather. They are often human beings who understand psychology well enough to exploit our natural instinct to help others in distress. The person behind that mine shaft trap knew exactly how to weaponize compassion, turning the virtues of good people against them. Sometimes I wonder if we were specifically targeted that day, or merely stumbled into their horrifying game. But I never question whether we made the right decision in walking away, because sometimes the most courageous act isn't to be a hero, but to refuse to be a victim. The pristine beauty of the mountains, once a sanctuary, now sometimes carries a whisper of menace. The rustle of leaves might be a deer, or it might be something far more sinister. It's a heavy burden, this knowledge that even in the vast, wild expanse, you're not safe from the calculated malice of another human. Our annual trips continue, but they're different now. There's an undercurrent of caution, a heightened awareness that never fully recedes. We've become advocates, sharing our story with fellow hikers, urging them to question the unexpected, to rely on their gut feelings, and to prioritize safety over a misguided sense of heroism when faced with suspicious circumstances. This experience, etched into our very souls, serves as a grim reminder that while nature can be unforgiving, the true monsters often wear human skin, lurking in the shadows, waiting to exploit the very best intentions for the most malevolent ends. It's a stark lesson in the enduring darkness that can exist even in the most breathtaking of landscapes. It was late September 2019 when I, Tom, decided to tackle a solo section hike through Virginia's stunning Shenandoah National Park. By then, I wasn't new to the wilderness. I'd been hiking for about 15 years, much of that time spent happily on my own. So, when my regular hiking buddy had to cancel our planned trip at the last minute because of work, I honestly saw it as a blessing, a perfect opportunity to truly clear my head and savor some much-needed solitude on the trail. I remember a coworker asking me, a hint of genuine concern in his voice, "Are you really sure about going alone?" I've heard some unsettling stories about that area recently. I just laughed it off, confidently assuring him that I'd done dozens of solo trips and knew exactly how to handle myself in the wild. Looking back, I suppose he had every right to be worried. I won't bore you with the minutiae of my planning, but what unfolded over those 4 days in the mountains completely shattered everything I thought I understood about being alone in nature. My hike began bright and early on a Thursday, launching from Skyline Drive with a goal of covering roughly 12 miles a day, traversing some of the park's more isolated stretches. The conditions were absolutely perfect. The air was crisp with the scent of autumn, the foliage blazed with vibrant color, and the skies were an unblemished crystal blue. For the first day and a half, everything flowed beautifully. I was making excellent time, drinking in the spectacular vistas, and relishing that profound sense of peace you only find when you're utterly disconnected from the hum of civilization. My original plan was to stick to designated campsites, but on that second night, I decided to deviate, choosing a more secluded spot, a small, hidden clearing I'd stumbled upon years ago about half a mile off the main trail. It was there, as I finally settled into my sleeping bag around 10:30 p.m. that I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Distinct, deliberate, measured steps, circling my campsite probably 50 yards out. My first thought naturally was that it was just a curious deer or a black bear, something I'd encountered countless times before. But as I listened, a chilling realization dawned. These footsteps had a rhythm, a cadence, that felt undeniably human. They'd walk for 30 seconds, pause for 10, then resume. This unsettling pattern continued for almost 20 minutes before abruptly ceasing. Heart pounding, I fumbled for my headlamp, zipped open my tent, and swept the beam across the surrounding tree line. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound friendly, imagining it might be a lost hiker or someone looking for a place to pitch their own tent. But there was no answer, just a profound, unsettling silence. After waiting several more minutes, hearing nothing but the rustle of leaves in the wind, I tried to rationalize it away, convincing myself it had to have been an animal, and with a knot in my stomach, I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, the unease solidified into something far more tangible. About 10 feet from my tent, I discovered the first gift. 7 small animal bones arranged in a perfect circle. They looked like they belonged to squirrels or chipmunks, completely stripped bare and bleached white, as if they'd been sun-dried for months. But it wasn't just the bones that disturbed me. It was their meticulous arrangement. Each one pointed inward, towards the center of the circle, with small rocks carefully placed between them in a pattern I couldn't begin to understand. The whole thing was perhaps 2 feet across, and I knew, with a certainty that prickled my skin, it hadn't been there when I'd set up camp the night before. My first desperate thought was that another hiker was playing some kind of elaborate prank, but the bones looked ancient, far too weathered to have been gathered recently, and the sheer precision of the arrangement hinted at someone who had invested considerable time and strange effort into its creation. I took a few hurried photos with my phone, then, trying to banish the growing sense of dread, I scattered the bones and packed up, pushing the unsettling feeling deep down as I continued on my way. That third night, I made a conscious decision to camp at an official site, desperately hoping the presence of other hikers would somehow scare off whatever unsettling presence might be shadowing me. However, the Cosby Knob shelter was utterly deserted when I arrived. Not entirely uncommon for a late September weekday, but it meant I was still completely alone. I quickly pitched my tent close to the shelter and built a small campfire, its flickering light and smoke a small beacon, hoping it might attract any other wanderers in the vicinity. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were much closer, perhaps 25 yards from my tent, and with a sickening certainty, I knew they were human. The distinct stride length, the subtle shift of weight from heel to toe, the occasional hesitant pause to navigate unseen obstacles, these were unmistakably human steps. Yet, whoever was out there was attempting to be silent, placing each footfall with meticulous care and deliberation. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the slow, deliberate circuit around my camp. The footsteps would halt for extended periods, sometimes 5 or even 10 minutes, before starting up again. During one of these agonizing pauses, I heard something that sent an icy tendril of fear snaking down my spine, a low, continuous humming sound, like someone singing a wordless tune, barely audible beneath their breath. It was just loud enough for me to perceive, yet too faint to distinguish any melody. After what felt like an eternity, the chilling sounds finally ceased. I didn't sleep a wink that night, clutching my knife, every nerve-ending strain, listening for the slightest hint of movement until the first rays of dawn touched the trees. As the sun finally peered over the horizon, I scrambled to pack my gear, a desperate urge to move driving me. I hiked quickly to the shelter to use the privy before hitting the trail again. And that's when I found the second gift. Suspended from the shelter's eaves, hanging by what appeared to be fishing line, was a small bundle, carefully wrapped in strips of bark. Inside were more bones, these from a larger animal, perhaps a raccoon, alongside several molted bird feathers and what looked like dried berries, all arranged with the same unnerving precision. There was also a small slip of paper, adorned with symbols sketched in what looked like charcoal. The symbols themselves were meaningless to me, but they too had been drawn with the identical, meticulous care evident in the bone arrangements. Every single instinct screamed at me to abandon my hike right then and there, to get off the trail and report my findings to the park rangers. But I'd committed to a 4-day trek, and a stubborn, perhaps foolish, part of me simply refused to let some unknown weirdo chase me out of the mountains. I tried to reassure myself I'd be extra careful, stay constantly alert, and if anything else happened, I'd make a beeline for the nearest road. That ill-fated decision, I now realize, very nearly cost me my life. For my 4th and final night, I deliberately picked a campsite near Hawkville Summit, convinced that the higher elevation and more open terrain would make it impossible for anyone to approach without being seen. I set up my tent in a small grove of trees about 50 yards below the summit, ensuring I had clear sight lines in every direction. I built another fire, feeding it steadily, determined to keep it blazing well into the night. This time I didn't have to wait for midnight. The footsteps started around 9:30 p.m., but they were different now. Faster, imbued with a strange confidence, as if whoever was out there had finally grown weary of their slow, stalking game. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, no longer attempting stealth, just circling my camp at an unnervingly steady pace. My heart leaped into my throat, but a surge of adrenaline pushed me. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, headlamp clutched in one hand, my knife in the other. I swept the beam across the tree line, my voice cracking slightly as I called out, "I know you're out there. What do you want?" The footsteps ceased instantly, but I could feel unequivocally eyes watching me from the impenetrable darkness just beyond the reach of my light. For what felt like an eternity, we held this silent standoff, me standing defensively beside my tent, slowly rotating, scanning the trees, while something lurked just beyond my vision. Then, I heard the humming again, louder this time, and now it seemed to come from multiple directions. It took a moment for my terrified brain to process that the sound itself was moving, circling my camp with the same relentless. My name is David, and April 2020 found me utterly adrift, grappling with what many might call a midlife crisis. At 47, freshly divorced and feeling completely lost, I made a spontaneous decision. 3 weeks off work for a solo section hike through the majestic Great Smoky Mountains. I was no stranger to hiking, but this was different, far more ambitious, much more remote than anything I'd ever attempted. When my brother, with a furrowed brow, asked, "Are you sure you're ready for something this challenging right now?" I remember telling him, quite earnestly, that I needed the profound solitude of the wilderness to find clarity, to somehow piece myself back together. Looking back, I suppose he was right to question my timing. While I won't burden you with the intimate details of why I felt such a desperate need to escape, what I ultimately discovered on that winding trail taught me a profound truth. Sometimes, getting lost in the mountains is nothing compared to the disorienting feeling of being lost in life. I began my journey at the Cataract Falls trailhead, my sights set on following the Appalachian Trail north through some of the Smokies' most secluded sections. The first 4 days unfolded beautifully, exactly as I'd envisioned. The weather was a hiker's dream, the trail markers clear and reassuring, and the deep quietude was precisely the balm my troubled mind craved. I was covering a respectable 14 miles a day, setting up camp at designated spots, and with each passing mile, I could almost feel the suffocating weight of my failed marriage and career disappointments begin to gently lift. Then, on the 5th day, everything irrevocably changed. I was about 3 miles north of Clingman's Dome when I arrived at a trail junction that simply wasn't on any of my maps. According to my trusted GPS and official trail guides, the Appalachian Trail should have continued straight for another 2 miles before reaching the next legitimate intersection. Yet there it was, stark and undeniable, a well-worn path veering east, adorned with what appeared to be official white blazes painted on the trees. I knew from experience that blazes could sometimes be faded or tricky to spot, so an unmarked junction wasn't an immediate cause for alarm. But these blazes were different. They looked strikingly fresh, a bright white against the bark, positioned at the exact height and spacing as the legitimate markers I'd been faithfully following for days. I stood there for several long minutes, my gaze flitting between my maps, my GPS, and the mysterious new path. Every piece of navigational information urged me to continue straight, but those gleaming white blazes leading east were undeniably persuasive in their official appearance. I tried to rationalize it, thinking perhaps my maps were outdated, or the Park Service had rerouted this section for maintenance or environmental protection. Trail reroutes weren't unheard of, and it would certainly explain the discrepancy. After a full 20 minutes of internal debate, I made the fateful decision to follow the blazes. The path itself seemed well maintained, and I could clearly see more white markers disappearing into the dense forest ahead, a visual promise of continuity. My reasoning was simple. If it was a legitimate reroute, it would eventually reconnect with the main trail. If not, I could always retrace my steps back to the junction. For the first hour, the path felt perfectly normal. It was perhaps a touch narrower than the main Appalachian Trail, but clearly established and showed distinct signs of regular use. The blazes appeared every 100 yards or so, just as they should. I made good time, covering roughly 3 miles before I paused for lunch near what looked like an old abandoned camping area. That's when a cold dread began to seep in, prompted by the first truly disturbing sign. Partially obscured by a pile of leaves near the cold, dead ashes of a fire ring, I discovered a torn piece of bright blue fabric. It looked like it had come from a hiking jacket or rain gear, and had clearly been exposed to the elements for some time. The fabric was faded and weathered, yet I could still distinctly make out what looked like dried bloodstains clinging to one edge. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I examined it more closely. The tear wasn't jagged or accidental. It looked deliberate, as if someone had cut it away with a knife, rather than snagging it on a branch. There were also several small, precise holes in the material, suggesting something sharp had been repeatedly pushed through it. My initial hopeful thought was that someone had been injured here and used the fabric as a makeshift bandage. But something about the entire scene felt profoundly wrong. This camping area, despite the clear signs of recent use, was eerily devoid of other human trace. No food wrappers, no footprints, no disturbed ground around the fire. Everything except that ominous piece of fabric had been meticulously cleaned up, as if someone had deliberately erased all other evidence of their presence. I stuffed the fabric into my pack, my earlier confidence now replaced by a growing unease, and continued following the blazes. But now my senses were on high alert, scrutinizing every shadow, every rustle in the undergrowth. Over the next 2 hours, the path felt increasingly wrong. It was leading me steadily away from where my GPS insisted the main trail should be, and the terrain itself was becoming noticeably more rugged and difficult to navigate. Around 4 p.m., I stumbled upon the second unsettling find. Wedged cunningly between 2 rocks just off the supposed trail was a small digital camera, the kind of robust, high-end model serious hikers often carry to document their adventures. It was in remarkably good condition, almost perfectly preserved, despite having obviously been outside for months, shielded from the elements by its rocky perch. When I tried to power it on, the battery was dead, but just looking at it, I knew it was an expensive piece of equipment, not something someone would casually abandon. Why would anyone leave such a valuable camera in the heart of the wilderness? And why go to the trouble of hiding it between rocks, rather than leaving it in plain sight where another hiker might find and return it? The whole situation was now screaming that something was gravely amiss. But I was nearly 6 miles from the junction where I'd left the main trail, and daylight was starting to wane. I decided to push on for another hour, clinging to the hope of finding either a suitable camping spot or some reassuring sign that the trail was indeed leading me back towards civilization. However, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, the blazes led me into increasingly treacherous terrain. I was now scrambling over loose rock, pushing through dense thorny undergrowth, my clothes catching and tearing, following markers that seemed to appear just often enough to keep me from turning back. That's when the horrifying truth finally dawned on me. The blazes were wrong. I'd spent over a decade hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I knew intimately that official trail markers were painted using a specific type of paint and a consistent brush technique, creating an unmistakable uniform appearance. But when I examined these blazes more closely under the beam of my headlamp, a chilling difference became clear. They had been painted with a distinct type of paint, slightly off in color, noticeably different in texture from the legitimate markers I'd been following earlier. Someone, with malicious intent, had been painting false blazes. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. Someone had meticulously, deliberately created a fake trail, complete with convincing markers, specifically designed to lure unsuspecting hikers away from the safety and known routes of the main trail. But why? And what had become of the people who owned the fabric and the camera I'd found? My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I immediately pulled out my GPS, desperate to get a bearing back to the legitimate trail. The screen, however, delivered another. My name is Ashley Coleman, and the summer of 2021 brought a lesson I'll never forget, etched into my very soul by the remote wilderness near the North Carolina and Tennessee border. That June, I was finally embarking on my first solo section hike along the Appalachian Trail. At 28, I considered myself a seasoned day hiker, but a multi-day solo trip into such an isolated area was entirely new territory. My father, bless his heart, had voiced his concerns, his voice a low rumble of worry. He'd said something like, "I've heard some strange things about that area lately, Ashley, and it gets incredibly remote up there." I, with the stubborn confidence of youth and preparation, had simply brushed him off, assuring him I was well prepared and that the trail was generally safe for solo female hikers. Well, it turns out Dad had every right to be worried. I won't bore you with the meticulous details of planning my first serious solo adventure, but what I endured during that unexpected storm taught me a chilling truth. Sometimes, the most perilous situations arise not from the wilderness itself, but from accepting help when you're at your most vulnerable and desperate. I started my hike on a Tuesday morning in mid-June, full of optimism and the thrill of the open trail. My plan was to cover about 10 miles a day, navigating through some of the most scenic yet challenging sections of the Appalachian Trail. The weather forecast had been pristine when I set out, promising clear skies and pleasant temperatures. But as nature often does, it had other plans. By the second day, conditions had deteriorated with an alarming speed that caught me completely off guard. What began as gentle afternoon showers quickly escalated into a ferocious thunderstorm system, unleashing torrential rain, blinding flashes of dangerous lightning, and a sudden, brutal temperature drop of nearly 20 degrees from earlier in the day. By late afternoon on that second day, I was utterly drenched despite my expensive rain gear, shivering uncontrollably, and struggling with every step to maintain my footing on the increasingly muddy and treacherous trail. The storm, instead of passing through as I had desperately hoped, was intensifying, coiling around me like a malevolent force. I realized then that I was facing a potentially life-threatening situation. Hypothermia was no longer a distant concern, but a very real and present danger. And the thought of trying to pitch my tent in the midst of a violent lightning storm was an unthinkable risk. It was then, through the swirling curtain of rain and the gloom of the forest, that I saw them. Lights piercing the darkness ahead. At first my mind, eager for relief, tried to rationalize it. Perhaps another hiker with an unusually bright headlamp. But as I pushed through the tangled undergrowth, getting closer with each arduous step, a cold dread began to mingle with my desperate hope. The lights were stationary, far too numerous, and much too bright to be coming from any personal camping equipment. Through the relentless rain and thickening fog, I could gradually make out the distinct shape of what appeared to be a small building or facility of some kind. It was completely hidden from the main trail, obscured by the dense trees, and, most unsettlingly, not marked on any of my detailed maps. The structure had the appearance of what one might imagine a trail maintenance facility or an emergency shelter to be, a single-story building, its windows glowing with a surprisingly warm, inviting light, and what looked like a covered area where equipment or perhaps vehicles might be stored. There were no signs, no markers, no indication whatsoever of what this facility was. Yet the very presence of electric lights in such a remote location suggested some kind of official, organized operation. As I drew nearer, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and relief, the door of the building opened. A man dressed in what seemed to be some sort of uniform stepped out under the covered area. He was probably in his 40s, clad in dark functional clothing that looked official, though it didn't resemble any park service or trail maintenance uniform I was familiar with. A radio was clipped to his belt and he held a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the rain. "Hey there," he called out, his voice surprisingly friendly, cutting through the roar of the storm. "You look like you could use some shelter from this storm. Why don't you come in and get dried off?" I was utterly frozen, soaked to the bone, and genuinely terrified for my safety in the rapidly worsening weather. The offer of warm, dry shelter was intoxicatingly appealing, and the man himself seemed professional, legitimate even. But despite the warmth of his invitation, something about the entire situation felt subtly, fundamentally wrong. The building wasn't on my maps. There were no identifying signs, and I had never heard of any trail maintenance or emergency shelters in this particular section of the Appalachian Trail. What kind of facility is this? I managed to ask, trying to inject a casual curiosity into my voice while instinctively maintaining a cautious distance. Trail maintenance station, he replied without a flicker of hesitation, his tone unwavering. We monitor this section of trail, handle emergency situations, coordinate with search and rescue. You picked a good night to stumble across us. This storm is supposed to get worse before it gets better. His explanation, on the surface, sounded perfectly reasonable, and the building certainly had the appearance of some kind of official facility. I could see what looked like communication antennas bristling on the roof. Several vehicles parked discreetly under the covered area and through the glowing windows. I glimpsed what appeared to be office equipment and maps adorning the walls. My rational mind desperately wanted to believe him. I'm Ashley, I said, finally taking a few hesitant steps closer to the building, my decision swayed by the gnawing cold and exhaustion. I'm section hiking through here and got caught in this weather. A warm, almost disarming smile spread across his face. Nice to meet you, Ashley, he responded. I'm Frank. Come on inside and we'll get you warmed up. We have coffee, dry clothes, and you can wait out the storm in comfort. Frank led me into the building, and the immediate rush of warmth and dryness was an indescribable relief. The interior, true to his word, looked professional. There were neat desks equipped with computers, sturdy filing cabinets, detailed maps covering the walls, and an array of communication equipment. Two other men were inside, both dressed in similar dark uniforms. They introduced themselves as Steve and Mike. All three seemed genuinely friendly and professional, asking about my hiking plans and expressing convincing concern about my safety in the raging storm. They immediately provided me with a steaming hot cup of coffee and a thick, dry towel to help me warm up. They suggested I could comfortably stay in their break room until the weather improved. The break room itself was unremarkable, containing several cots, seemingly for staff who worked overnight shifts, along with basic amenities like a small kitchen and a clean bathroom. For the first hour or so, everything felt perfectly normal, almost comforting. The three men continued with what appeared to be their routine work, checking equipment, monitoring radio communications, and diligently updating logs and paperwork. They periodically checked on me, ensuring I was comfortable, and even offered food from their surprisingly well-stocked kitchen. But as the evening wore on, a subtle unease began to creep in, a gnawing feeling that grew steadily into a deep, unsettling discomfort. First, none of the radio communications I faintly overheard sounded like legitimate trail maintenance or emergency response traffic. The conversations were always brief and strangely cryptic, peppered with terminology I didn't recognize, and they discussed activities that seemed entirely unrelated to trail management or safety. Second, despite their initial claims of monitoring the trail for safety, they seemed remarkably uninterested in my specific hiking plans or in coordinating with any outside agencies about my unexpected presence in the area. Legitimate trail. Maintenance personnel, I knew, would typically be keen to gather detailed information, where I had come from, where I was planning to go, and whether anyone was expecting me to check in. Their lack of curiosity felt like a gaping hole in their professional facade. Most concerning of all, I noticed that all the maps plastered on the walls had markings that didn't correspond to any official trail information I had ever seen. There were peculiar symbols and cryptic notations that looked disturbingly like they might indicate surveillance positions, patrol routes, or other clandestine activities that had absolutely nothing to do with trail maintenance. The friendly facade was starting to crack. Around 10 p.m., Frank approached me, his smile still pleasant, but his eyes holding an unreadable quality. He informed me that they were switching to their night shift operation and that I should remain in the break room for my own safety. He explained with a practiced casualness that they conducted different types of work at night, activities that could be dangerous for civilians to observe. What kind of work? I asked, trying desperately to sound casually curious rather than overtly suspicious, my heart beginning to thump an anxious rhythm against my ribs. Security patrols, equipment testing, coordination with other agencies, he replied vaguely, his gaze unwavering. Nothing for you to worry about, Ashley. But we need to ask that you stay inside until morning. It was at that precise moment that the chilling realization hit me, a cold wave of understanding washing over my exhaustion and fear. I wasn't in a trail maintenance facility at all. Whatever these people were doing, it was far from legitimate trail management. and my accidental presence had created a situation they now needed to control. The friendly offers of help, the warm coffee, the reassuring smiles, they had all been meticulously designed to lure me inside the building. Now I was effectively being held against my will. My mind raced. "I'm feeling much better," I declared, my voice wavering slightly despite my best efforts. "I think I want to continue hiking, storm or no storm." But Frank's response left no room for doubt. Leaving was not an option. "I'm afraid I cannot let you do that," he said. His tone was still friendly, almost apologetic, but beneath it lay an unshakable firmness that made his meaning absolutely clear. "The storm is still dangerous, and our night operations create additional safety hazards. You will be much safer staying here until morning." Steve and Mike, who had been seemingly busy with their tasks, had now stopped all activity and were focused entirely on me. I could see, with a terrifying clarity, that all three men were armed with what appeared to be firearms holstered at their hips, though they had not yet made any overtly threatening gestures. I spent the next several agonizing hours pretending to sleep on one of the cots, my mind racing a million miles an hour, desperately trying to figure out how to escape. The building had several exits, but through the windows, I could discern that at least one person was always positioned outside, seemingly on guard duty. The storm was still raging, a violent symphony outside, which would make any escape attempt incredibly dangerous, even if I managed to slip out of the building undetected. Around 3 a.m., a snippet of conversation, overheard between Frank and someone on the radio, sent a fresh wave of ice-cold terror through my veins. They were discussing the hiker situation and coordinating with what sounded like other similar facilities in the region. The conversation included chilling references to processing people who had seen too much, and, more horrifyingly, coordinating with disposal teams. It was then that the full, grim reality slammed into me. Whatever clandestine operation these people were running, they clearly had protocols in place for dealing with civilians who accidentally stumbled upon their activities. And those protocols, it became terrifyingly clear, apparently involved ensuring those civilians never had a chance to report what they had seen. I knew, with an absolute certainty that transcended all fear of the storm, that I had to get out of there immediately, regardless of the treacherous weather conditions outside. Around 4 a.m., through a gap in my feigned slumber, I noticed a crucial shift. The guard outside had moved to a position where he could not see one of the rear exits. This was my chance. I quietly, meticulously gathered my gear, every movement a silent prayer, slipped out of the break room, and made my way to the back door. The storm, though still intense, had lessened its fury slightly compared to earlier in the evening. I managed to get out of the building and into the dense, dark woods without being detected, then immediately began working my way back toward the main trail, relying solely on my compass and GPS, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. The next few hours were some of the most terrifying of my entire life. I could distinctly hear vehicles moving through the area, their engines a low growl in the distance, and several times I saw flashlight beams sweeping through the woods, agonizingly close as the men searched for me. I had to move excruciatingly slowly and carefully, each step calculated to avoid making any noise or being detected, all while navigating through incredibly rough terrain in near total darkness and the relentless chilling rain. Just after dawn, my legs burning, my body aching, I finally reached a section of the main trail. It was there, like a beacon of salvation, that I encountered two legitimate hikers heading southbound. Their presence was an overwhelming relief, a tangible link back to the world I knew. They were able to confirm my location, and with their help, I navigated to the nearest road crossing where, without a moment's hesitation, I immediately contacted local authorities. The sheriff's department took my harrowing report seriously and organized an immediate investigation of the area where I had found the mysterious facility. But when they arrived at the location I had painstakingly described, the building was completely gone, vanished. There was no trace, no evidence whatsoever that any structure had ever existed there. No foundation, no cleared area, no equipment, nothing but undisturbed wilderness. The investigator, a kind but weary man, told me that they had been aware of scattered reports of suspicious activities in that remote region for some time, but had never been able to locate any concrete evidence of illegal operations. My description of a mobile or temporary facility, one that could be quickly dismantled and removed, chillingly fit with their theories about how such operations might effectively evade detection. 6 months later, a federal agent contacted me. He explained that my detailed report had become a crucial piece of a much larger investigation into illegal activities occurring in remote wilderness areas. He couldn't or wouldn't provide intricate details about the exact nature of the investigation, but he did confirm that organized criminal operations were indeed exploiting the isolation of places like the Appalachian Trail to conduct activities that required complete secrecy from both law enforcement and the general public. I never did find out exactly what those people were doing in that facility, what their cryptic conversations and unusual maps truly meant. But the agent's parting words lingered with a chilling weight. He strongly suggested that my daring escape had, in all likelihood, saved my life. He confirmed that people who accidentally discovered such operations were considered significant security threats who needed to be neutralized to protect the larger criminal enterprise. I still hike. The call of the wilderness is too strong to ignore, but my approach has fundamentally changed. I never go alone anymore, and I never, ever venture out without detailed check-in protocols, established with multiple trusted people who know precisely where I am supposed to be and when. Most importantly, I have learned a profound and terrifying lesson. Accepting help from strangers in the wilderness requires the exact same caution and skepticism that you would apply in any other situation where you might be vulnerable to predators. The wilderness, in all its untamed beauty, attracts people who seek to escape the oversight and regulations of civilized society. And unfortunately, that includes individuals who want to escape those constraints specifically so they can engage in criminal activities without interference. The vast size and sheer remoteness of places like the Appalachian Trail make them perfect, almost ideal, locations for operations that demand complete secrecy and isolation from law enforcement. Sometimes, still, I wake up in a cold sweat, replaying those terrifying hours, wondering what would have happened if I had not overheard that radio conversation, or if I had not been able to slip away undetected into the stormy night. But I never, for a single moment, wonder whether I was overreacting or being paranoid, because what I learned, in the most visceral way possible, is that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness aren't the bears or the mountain lions. They are the human ones who understand exactly how to exploit our trust and our desperation for help when we are at our absolute weakest and most vulnerable. The memory of that night, even years later, remains a vivid, haunting presence. It's a stark reminder that beneath the serene canopy of ancient trees and the breathtaking vistas of the mountains, there can lurk a darkness far more chilling than any natural threat. The pristine wild, a sanctuary for so many, can also become a canvas for human malevolence, a place where the ordinary rules of society simply don't apply. I've often thought about those men, their polite smiles, and the casual menace that underlay their offers of aid. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense, but calculated individuals, leveraging the very human instinct for survival against those like me who sought solace in nature. My experience underscored the fragility of safety, even in places we perceive as inherently safe. It taught me that while the grandeur of the wilderness offers unparalleled freedom, it also demands an unyielding vigilance, a constant awareness that the greatest dangers often wear the most deceptive disguises. The profound sense of isolation that draws adventurers to these remote trails can, in a terrifying twist, become their greatest liability when confronted by those who exploit it. Pace as the footsteps. But now, there were no footsteps at all. Just that low, wordless humming, weaving through the darkness like a ghostly, disembodied chorus. And then, I saw it. About 30 yards away, right at the very edge of my headlamp's straining beam, something tall and impossibly thin stepped out from behind a tree. It held a distinctly human shape, yes, but it was wrong. Too elongated, too angular, moving with a strange, almost jerky gait, like a marionette being clumsily manipulated. The figure stood utterly motionless for several agonizing seconds, while the omnipresent humming continued, now emanating from various points in the surrounding darkness. "Who are you?" I demanded again, my voice louder now, tinged with pure terror. "What do you want?" No answer came. Instead, the figure began to walk towards me. Its movement was both hypnotic and utterly terrifying. Each step was placed with precise, unnatural deliberation, arms swinging in perfect robotic rhythm, head held unnaturally stiff and straight. As it drew nearer, more details emerged from the shadows. It wore what looked like hiking clothes, but they hung strangely loose, as if several sizes too large. The face was completely obscured by the deep shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but I could make out unnervingly pale hands dangling from sleeves that extended far past the wrists. When the figure reached the very edge of my firelight, perhaps 15 feet from where I stood frozen, it stopped. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one arm and pointed directly at me. That's when I saw the third gift. Clutched in its pointing hand was another small bundle, larger than the previous ones, tied with what looked like strips of cloth. Even from 15 feet away, I could distinctly see dark, ominous stains on the fabric and catch the faint, sickly sweet odor of something truly rank and putrid wafting from it. The figure held it out towards me, an unsettling offering, as the humming from the darkness intensified, growing louder and more insistent. I instinctively recoiled, backing towards my tent, my eyes glued to the horrifying sight, and frantically grabbed my backpack. "Stay away from me," I managed to croak, trying desperately to keep my voice steady. "I'm leaving. Just leave me alone." The figure remained utterly still, but the humming suddenly, chillingly, ceased. In the profound silence that followed, all I could hear was my own ragged, rapid breathing and the nervous crackle of my campfire. Then, from somewhere deeper, in the darkness, directly behind the figure, a voice emerged, low, raspy, and barely human. "You cannot leave," it rasped. "Not yet. We have been waiting for you." That was the precise moment I broke, and I ran. I abandoned everything, my tent, my gear, my carefully packed supplies, taking only my backpack and headlamp, and plunged headlong into the trees, crashing blindly in what I hoped was the general direction of the main trail. Behind me, a cacophony erupted, multiple voices calling out, some with chilling laughter, some resuming that same eerie humming, others speaking in words I couldn't possibly understand. I ran for what felt like an eternity, probably miles, stumbling over unseen rocks and tearing through thick underbrush, desperately following any faint deer path or game trail I could discern in the frantic beam of my headlamp. I was utterly lost, yet too paralyzed by terror to even consider stopping. Finally, just as the first slivers of dawn painted the sky, I burst onto a paved road, utterly spent, bleeding from countless cuts and scrapes, my body shaking uncontrollably. An hour later, a park ranger found me there, huddled on the guardrail, in a profound state of shock. I recounted every harrowing detail to him. The unsettling bone arrangements, the relentless circling footsteps, the disembodied humming in the darkness, and the terrifying figure with its putrid offering. He listened with an almost unnerving patience before driving me to the ranger station, where I repeated my unbelievable story to two other officials. To my immense relief, they took my report seriously. They swiftly organized a thorough search of the area where I had camped. They found my abandoned tent and gear, exactly as I had left them, along with the cold remains of my campfire. But they discovered far more than just my belongings. They found additional bone arrangements, some significantly older and more intricately designed than the ones I had encountered. And, hidden in a small cave, merely a quarter-mile from my last campsite, they uncovered what appeared to be a long-term encampment, complete with supplies, tools, and dozens of the disturbing, cloth-wrapped bundles I had seen the figure carrying. The rangers then revealed something even more chilling. They had received similar reports over the past 2 years. Hikers describing being followed, discovering strange arrangements of bones and objects, hearing disembodied voices in the darkness. Several people had even reported encounters with unusually tall, thin figures moving in unsettling ways. But I, they admitted, was the first to provide such a detailed description and, critically, to have stuck around long enough for a comprehensive investigation. 3 weeks later, the park rangers finally made an arrest. The man was Carl Morrison, who had been living illegally within the park's boundaries for over 2 years. They found him deep in the backcountry, in a makeshift shelter, surrounded by the very materials he'd been using to create his unsettling gifts for unsuspecting hikers. Morrison, it turned out, had a history of mental illness and had seemingly developed a twisted obsession with what he termed collecting specimens, from anyone who dared to venture into what he considered his own private territory. But here's the detail, the haunting truth that still gnaws at me and keeps me awake some nights. Carl Morrison was only 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighing perhaps 140 pounds. The figure I saw that terrifying night was unequivocally well over 6 feet tall, moving with a disturbing, inhuman fluidity that no normal person could ever achieve. When I pressed the Rangers on this glaring discrepancy, they offered explanations about fear and darkness distorting perceptions, suggesting Morrison might have worn a costume or even platform shoes to appear taller and more menacing. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps my experience was merely the product of an unbalanced man's elaborate, terrifying game. But I know, with every fiber of my being, what I saw and what I heard that night. And even now, when I find myself alone, in the deep wilderness, a part of me is always listening for the faint, measured rhythm of footsteps, circling just beyond the comforting glow of my campfire light. That encounter permanently altered my relationship with the wild. Before, the mountains were a sanctuary, a place of profound peace and predictable challenges. Now, they hold a darker, more ambiguous secret. The vast silence I once cherished sometimes feels pregnant with unseen watchful eyes, and every rustle in the leaves can send a shiver down my spine. The Ranger's explanation, while logical, never fully extinguished the unsettling image burned into my mind. Could a costume truly explain that chilling grace, that unnatural stillness, that unnervingly rhythmic movement? The human mind, they say, can play tricks under duress, but the memory of that rasping, barely human voice, "We have been waiting for you," feels too real, too visceral to be a mere figment of fear. It suggests a patient, deliberate malice far beyond the scope of one man's delusion. Sometimes I wonder if Morrison was merely a pawn, an echo of something older, something truly indigenous and unsettling to those ancient woods. The wilderness, it seems, has depths we barely comprehend, and some of its inhabitants prefer to remain forever shrouded in the mist, their motives and forms a terrifying enigma. I still hike, but never alone, and never without a constant, vigilant awareness of the shadows. The mountains still call, but their song is now interwoven with a low, wordless hum, a constant reminder of what lurks just beyond the firelight. Gut punch. I was now nearly 12 miles from the main Appalachian Trail, deep in uncharted wilderness, with no established paths leading back. Worse still, the terrain between my current position and the true trail was brutally rough. Steep ravines, impenetrable forest, and jagged rocky outcrops that would be treacherous to navigate in broad daylight, let alone in the encroaching darkness. I had no choice but to make camp right where I was and pray I could find my way back in the morning. I found a relatively flat spot amidst some large boulders and quickly set up my tent, but I consciously chose not to build a fire. A primal instinct screamed that the situation felt dangerous, and I had no desire to advertise my presence to whoever might have created this sinister false trail. As I lay cocooned in my sleeping bag that night, the chilling conviction that I wasn't alone in those mountains became an oppressive weight. Every sound, the delicate snap of a twig, the soft rustle of leaves, was magnified, twisted into a potential threat. Around midnight, a new horror emerged. I heard what sounded unmistakably like voices in the distance. They were too far away, too distorted by the rugged terrain to make out any specific words, but they were undeniably human conversation. I lay rigid and awake until dawn, my ears strained, trying to pinpoint their direction. They seemed to emanate from somewhere ahead of me, deeper into the wilderness, precisely where the false blazes had been leading. Whatever was out there, whoever was speaking, I was absolutely certain I didn't want to encounter them. The moment the first gray light of morning appeared, I used my GPS to plot a desperate course back towards the main trail, resolutely ignoring the deceitful false blazes. It took me nearly 8 brutal hours of relentless hiking through unmarked wilderness to cover the distance I had traveled in a mere 6 hours on the false trail. I had to rappel down 2 perilous steep ravines and push through miles of dense undergrowth, thorns tearing at my clothes and gear, branches scratching my skin. When I finally stumbled back onto the blessed familiar path of the Appalachian Trail, I was utterly exhausted, severely dehydrated, and bleeding from dozens of cuts. But I was alive, and I was back on a legitimate path that would lead me to safety. I hiked directly to the nearest ranger station and, with a mixture of relief and lingering terror, reported everything I had experienced. The insidious false blazes, the blood-stained torn fabric, the abandoned camera, and the terrifying voices I had heard in the night. The rangers listened with grave faces, taking my report incredibly seriously, and immediately organized an extensive search of the area. What they ultimately discovered was far worse than anything I had imagined. Following the false blazes to their horrifying endpoint, they found a crude makeshift campsite hidden deep within a ravine, approximately 2 miles from where I had wisely turned back. The site contained the personal belongings of at least 6 different hikers, backpacks, sleeping bags, identification documents, and various personal items that had clearly been taken from people over a period of several months. And then they found Harold Wickham. Harold, a 63-year-old retired teacher from Ohio, had been reported missing 3 weeks prior while attempting his own solo section hike through the Smokies. The rangers found him in a barely there shelter, severely malnourished and suffering from advanced exposure. But miraculously, he was alive. He recounted a chillingly familiar story. He had followed the same false blazes, just as I had. But when he tried to turn back, he had become hopelessly lost and injured his ankle in a fall. According to Harold, he had been surviving on meager rations of food and water, desperately trying to signal for help. But the ravine was simply too deep and remote for his emergency whistle or mirror to be effective. He had seen signs that someone else was in the area, footprints around his shelter, food that had been moved or taken, but he never once saw who it was. The rangers never apprehended the person or persons responsible for creating the false trail, but they did uncover that similar incidents had been reported in other remote areas of the park over the past year. Someone was systematically crafting these fake trails, designed with insidious precision to lure hikers into dangerous situations, though their ultimate, twisted motivation remained horrifyingly unclear. Harold, thankfully, recovered fully, and the camera I found contained photos from 3 different hikers who had apparently fallen victim to the same sinister scheme. The rangers were able to identify 2 of them from the photographs and confirmed that both individuals had been reported missing within the past 6 months. After a few days of much-needed rest and recovery, I did manage to complete my planned hike, but a deep-seated change had occurred within me. I never again trusted a trail marker without meticulously confirming it against multiple maps and GPS readings, my instincts now forever sharpened by the memory of that terrifying detour. Even now, when I'm hiking alone in particularly remote areas, a shiver still traces its way down my spine, and I find myself wondering, with a cold, persistent dread, what would have truly happened if I had continued following those false blazes just a little further into that hidden ravine. I often replay the scenario in my mind, questioning whether I would have possessed the sheer strength and cunning to survive whatever malevolent presence was patiently waiting there in the profound, suffocating darkness. The incident left an indelible mark, making me question not just the paths I walk in the wilderness, but also the unseen dangers that can lie hidden behind seemingly benign facades in life itself. It was a stark lesson in vigilance, a terrifying reminder that some wildernesses are not just external landscapes, but also exist within the darker corners of human intention. The mountains, once a source of pure solace, now held a dual nature for me. Beauty intertwined with an unsettling, potent threat. My name is David, and April 2020 found me utterly adrift, grappling with what many might call a midlife crisis. At 47, freshly divorced and feeling completely lost, I made a spontaneous decision. 3 weeks off work for a solo section hike through the majestic Great Smoky Mountains. I was no stranger to hiking, but this was different, far more ambitious, much more remote than anything I'd ever attempted. When my brother, with a furrowed brow, asked, "Are you sure you're ready for something this challenging right now?" I remember telling him quite earnestly that I needed the profound solitude of the wilderness to find clarity, to somehow piece myself back together. Looking back, I suppose he was right to question my timing. While I won't burden you with the intimate details of why I felt such a desperate need to escape, what I ultimately discovered on that winding trail taught me a profound truth. Sometimes, getting lost in the mountains is nothing compared to the disorienting feeling of being lost in life. I began my journey at the Cataract Falls trailhead, my sights set on following the Appalachian Trail north through some of the Smokies' most secluded sections. The first 4 days unfolded beautifully, exactly as I'd envisioned. The weather was a hiker's dream, the trail markers clear and reassuring, and the deep quietude was precisely the balm my troubled mind craved. I was covering a respectable 14 miles a day, setting up camp at designated spots, and with each passing mile, I could almost feel the suffocating weight of my failed marriage and career disappointments begin to gently lift. Then, on the 5th day, everything irrevocably changed. I was about 3 miles north of Clingman's Dome when I arrived at a trail junction that simply wasn't on any of my maps. According to my trusted GPS and official trail guides, the Appalachian Trail should have continued straight for another 2 miles before reaching the next legitimate intersection. Yet there it was, stark and undeniable. A well-worn path veering east, adorned with what appeared to be official white blazes painted on the trees. I knew from experience that blazes could sometimes be faded or tricky to spot, so an unmarked junction wasn't an immediate cause for alarm. But these blazes were different. They looked strikingly fresh, a bright white against the bark, positioned at the exact height and spacing as the legitimate markers I'd been faithfully following for days. I stood there for several long minutes, my gaze flitting between my maps, my GPS, and the mysterious new path. Every piece of navigational information urged me to continue straight, but those gleaming white blazes leading east were undeniably persuasive in their official appearance. I tried to rationalize it, thinking perhaps my maps were outdated, or the Park Service had rerouted this section for maintenance or environmental protection. Trail reroutes weren't unheard of, and it would certainly explain the discrepancy. After a full 20 minutes of internal debate, I made the fateful decision to follow the blazes. The path itself seemed well maintained, and I could clearly see more white markers disappearing into the dense forest ahead, a visual promise of continuity. My reasoning was simple. If it was a legitimate reroute, it would eventually reconnect with the main trail. If not, I could always retrace my steps back to the junction. For the first hour, the path felt perfectly normal. It was perhaps a touch narrower than the main Appalachian Trail, but clearly established and showed distinct signs of regular use. The blazes appeared every 100 yards or so, just as they should. I made good time, covering roughly 3 miles before I paused for lunch near what looked like an old abandoned camping area. That's when a cold dread began to seep in, prompted by the first truly disturbing sign. Partially obscured by a pile of leaves near the cold dead ashes of a fire ring, I discovered a torn piece of bright blue fabric. It looked like it had come from a hiking jacket or rain gear, and had clearly been exposed to the elements for some time. The fabric was faded and weathered, yet I could still distinctly make out what looked like dried bloodstains clinging to one edge. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I examined it more closely. The tear wasn't jagged or accidental. It looked deliberate, as if someone had cut it away with a knife, rather than snagging it on a branch. There were also several small, precise holes in the material, suggesting something sharp had been repeatedly pushed through it. My initial hopeful thought was that someone had been injured here and used the fabric as a makeshift bandage. But something about the entire scene felt profoundly wrong. This camping area, despite the clear signs of recent use, was eerily devoid of other human trace. No food wrappers, no footprints, no disturbed ground around the fire. Everything except that ominous piece of fabric had been meticulously cleaned up, as if someone had deliberately erased all other evidence of their presence. I stuffed the fabric into my pack, my earlier confidence now replaced by a growing unease, and continued following the blazes. But now my senses were on high alert, scrutinizing every shadow, every rustle in the undergrowth. Over the next 2 hours, the path felt increasingly wrong. It was leading me steadily away from where my GPS insisted the main trail should be, and the terrain itself was becoming noticeably more rugged and difficult to navigate. Around 4 p.m., I stumbled upon the second unsettling find. Wedged cunningly between 2 rocks just off the supposed trail was a small digital camera, the kind of robust, high-end model serious hikers often carry to document their adventures. It was in remarkably good condition, almost perfectly preserved, despite having obviously been outside for months, shielded from the elements by its rocky perch. When I tried to power it on, the battery was dead, but just looking at it, I knew it was an expensive piece of equipment, not something someone would casually abandon. Why would anyone leave such a valuable camera in the heart of the wilderness? And why go to the trouble of hiding it between rocks, rather than leaving it in plain sight where another hiker might find and return it? The whole situation was now screaming that something was gravely amiss. But I was nearly 6 miles from the junction where I'd left the main trail and daylight was starting to wane. I decided to push on for another hour, clinging to the hope of finding either a suitable camping spot or some reassuring sign that the trail was indeed leading me back towards civilization. However, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, the blazes led me into increasingly treacherous terrain. I was now scrambling over loose rock, pushing through dense thorny undergrowth, my clothes catching and tearing, following markers that seemed to appear just often enough to keep me from turning back. That's when the horrifying truth finally dawned on me. The blazes were wrong. I'd spent over a decade hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I knew intimately that official trail markers were painted using a specific type of paint and a consistent brush technique, creating an unmistakable uniform appearance. But when I examined these blazes more closely under the beam of my headlamp, a chilling difference became clear. They had been painted with a distinct type of paint, slightly off in color, noticeably different in texture from the legitimate markers I'd been following earlier. Someone, with malicious intent, had been painting false blazes. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. Someone had meticulously, deliberately created a fake trail, complete with convincing markers, specifically designed to lure unsuspecting hikers away from the safety and known routes of the main trail. But why? And what had become of the people who owned the fabric and the camera I'd found? My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I immediately pulled out my GPS, desperate to get a bearing back to the legitimate trail. The screen, however, delivered another. It was September 2020, and I was just 5 days shy of realizing a lifelong dream. At 52 years old, I, Samuel Brooks, had spent 6 grueling months walking from Georgia to Maine, covering over 2,000 miles of the eastern United States' most challenging terrain. As I closed in on Mount Katahdin, my heart was a mix of exhaustion and pure euphoria. I could almost taste the summit celebration, already composing the stories I'd tell friends and family back home. A fellow hiker I'd met near Monson had offered a strange caution. Be careful those last few days. I heard there have been some weird incidents with people targeting successful thru-hikers near the end of their journey. I'd brushed him off, confident in my safety after so many miles, too close to the finish to entertain such unlikely dangers. I suppose he was right to be concerned. I won't burden you with the full scope of physical and emotional challenges of a 6-month thru hike. But what unfolded in those final days taught me a chilling truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones who deliberately seek you out when you are most vulnerable, when you have the most to lose. My entire journey had been meticulously documented on a popular hiking blog. I'd posted regular updates about my progress, the hurdles I faced, and the incredible experiences I had along the trail. The blog had gathered a modest but dedicated following of fellow hikers and outdoor enthusiasts who were living vicariously through my adventure. I shared daily mileage, camping spots, weather conditions, and encounters with fascinating people. It was my lifeline to the outside world, and I hoped it inspired others to embark on their own long-distance treks. Entering the final section in Maine, I was making excellent time, feeling stronger than I had in months. Despite the immense physical toll, my blog followers were excitedly tracking my every step toward Katahdin, flooding me with encouraging messages as I neared the finish line. On my second to last day, deep in the remote wilderness south of Baxter State Park, I came across what seemed like a trail angel. These wonderful volunteers are the backbone of the hiking community, offering support and encouragement. Everything from rides to town to hot meals, or just a simple word of cheer when hikers need it most. This particular angel introduced himself as Mark. He claimed he'd been following my blog and wanted to congratulate me on my incredible achievement. He looked to be in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in expensive outdoor gear, and driving a late model SUV perfectly suited for the rough back roads. "Samuel Brooks, right?" he asked with a warm, disarming smile as I approached his vehicle. "I've been reading your blog religiously for months. What an incredible journey you've documented. You should be immensely proud." I was flattered and genuinely surprised that someone had gone to such lengths to meet me in this remote spot. Mark seemed genuinely enthusiastic, asking detailed questions about specific challenging sections I'd described. He had clearly paid close attention, referencing stories and experiences I'd shared with uncanny accuracy. "I know you're probably eager to finish strong," Mark continued, but I was wondering if you'd be interested in a little pre-summit celebration. I've rented a cabin about 20 minutes from here, and I'd love to offer you a real meal, a hot shower, and a comfortable bed for your last night on the trail. Consider it my way of honoring your accomplishment." The offer was incredibly tempting. After 6 months of sleeping on the ground and subsisting on trail food, the thought of a hot shower and a real bed felt almost irresistible. Mark truly seemed like a benevolent trail angel, aiming to provide a memorable conclusion to my epic journey. Yet something gnawed at me. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, but a subtle unease settled in. Mark knew too many specific details about my experiences, almost as if he'd memorized my blog posts. His questions felt more probing than what you'd expect from a casual follower, and he seemed particularly interested in my exact timeline for reaching Katahdin. "That's incredibly generous," I said, choosing my words carefully, "but I've already made arrangements for tonight. I'm planning to camp at Rainbow Lake and then make my final push to Katahdin first thing in the morning." Mark appeared disappointed, but not surprised. "I understand completely," he replied. "The final stretch is sacred, and you want to experience it on your own terms. But please, at least let me give you some supplies for your last night. I brought some special trail food, fresh water, and a few other things that might make your final evening more comfortable." He opened the back of his SUV and began pulling out what looked like high-quality trail supplies. Freeze-dried meals, energy bars, electrolyte drinks, items that certainly would be welcome. After months of rationing and resupplying, everything looked authentic and expensive, the kind of gear serious hikers rely on for extended wilderness trips. It was as Mark organized the supplies that I saw something that made my blood run cold. Partially hidden under a tarp in the back of his SUV, I glimpsed what appeared to be restraints, zip ties, rope, and then a small cage or kennel. It wasn't sized for an animal, but for a human being. I fought to keep my expression neutral, my mind racing. Mark continued to talk about my blog and my journey, but now his questions felt less like admiration and more like an interrogation. He pressed me on my exact summit plans, whether anyone was meeting me, my plans after the trail, and if my family or friends were closely tracking my progress. "You know," Mark said, still arranging supplies but his eyes fixed on my face, "I've been following several thru hikers this year, and yours is by far the most impressive journey. You've really documented everything beautifully. Your followers feel like they know you personally." That's when the horrifying truth clicked into place. Mark wasn't just some random trail angel who'd stumbled upon my blog. He was a predator, specifically targeting successful thru hikers, using their own digital footprint to learn their habits, preferences, and deepest vulnerabilities. He had been studying me for months, meticulously gathering every piece of information about my journey, my personality, my routines. The supplies he offered weren't gifts. They were bait, designed to lower my guard or lure me to a remote location where he could overpower me without interference. The restraints in his vehicle painted a chilling picture. His plan involved taking me alive, for reasons I dared not contemplate. Actually, I managed, slowly backing away from the vehicle, trying to sound casual despite the growing panic in my chest. I just remembered I promised to check in with my wife at a specific time today, and I'm running behind schedule. I really need to get moving to find cell coverage. Mark's demeanor shifted instantly. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "That is unfortunate," he said, the benevolent trail angel facade crumbling. "I was really hoping we could spend some time together discussing your experiences in more detail." I continued walking backward toward the trail, eyes locked on him. "Maybe we can connect after I finish," I offered, desperate to maintain the pretense of normal conversation while creating crucial distance. But Mark was no longer playing along. He reached into his vehicle and pulled out what looked like a telescoping baton, the kind law enforcement uses for crowd control. "Samuel," he said, his voice now utterly devoid of warmth, professional, threatening, "I think you misunderstood the nature of this conversation. This is not actually optional." That was my cue. I ran. I crashed through the woods toward the main trail, pushing my full pack with every ounce of strength I had. Behind me, I could hear Mark giving chase on foot. He was clearly in excellent physical condition, gaining on me despite my 6-month head start in trail fitness. But I had two crucial advantages. I knew the terrain from my meticulous map studies, and I was desperate enough to take risks a rational person would avoid. I burst onto the main trail and bolted north, running as fast as I could sustain, praying to reach Rainbow Lake where there might be other hikers or a shelter. Behind me, Mark crashed through the underbrush, and several times I caught terrifying glimpses of him through the trees as he tried to parallel my route. After about 2 miles of the most intense running of my life, I reached a section of trail I knew well, a narrow passage with a steep drop-off on one side and a cliff face on the other. It was a bottleneck, forcing Mark to approach me from behind rather than flanking or surrounding me. I stopped, turned to face him, and pulled out my hiking knife and emergency whistle. When Mark emerged from the woods, all pretense of being a friendly trail angel was gone. He held the baton in one hand and what appeared to be a taser in the other, his expression that of a predator briefly thwarted but confident of ultimate success. "This is going to be much more difficult than it needed to be," he panted, still breathing hard from the chase. "I had planned to make this comfortable for you, but now we are going to have to do things the hard way." I activated my emergency beacon and began blowing my whistle as loudly as possible, keeping my knife ready. The narrow passage was my only defense. Mark couldn't easily rush me without exposing himself to the blade, but it also meant I had no escape if he managed to get past my defenses. For several agonizing minutes, we faced each other in a standoff that felt ripped from an old Western movie. Mark tried to close the distance multiple times, but each time I forced him back with the knife, never letting up on the emergency whistle. I could see his frustration mounting, his carefully laid abduction plan unraveling into a prolonged confrontation that drastically increased his risk of discovery. Finally, we heard it, the sound we were both listening for, voices approaching from the north. Other hikers had heard my desperate whistle and were coming to investigate. Mark immediately turned and melted back into the woods, moving with the same speed and stealth that had allowed him to pursue me earlier. The approaching hikers turned out to be a group of day hikers familiar with emergency protocols. They helped me contact local authorities using their satellite communicator and stayed with me until law enforcement arrived. The ensuing investigation revealed Mark's true identity, Marcus Fletcher. He had been targeting successful thru hikers for over 2 years, using social media, hiking blogs, and trail forums to identify potential victims, learning their routes, preferences, and personal information before approaching them as a benevolent trail angel. Investigators discovered Fletcher had successfully abducted at least 3 other thru hikers over the past 2 years, all of whom had vanished without a trace near the end of their journeys. Their families had simply assumed they'd suffered accidents or gotten lost, never suspecting they had been deliberately targeted by someone who understood precisely how to exploit the trust and vulnerability of exhausted hikers so close to achieving their dreams. The cabin Fletcher had mentioned was real, and when authorities searched it, they found chilling evidence of the other victims, along with what appeared to be a sophisticated operation for holding people against their will for extended periods. The investigation suggested Fletcher was selling his victims to individuals or organizations, willing to pay substantial amounts for people who wouldn't be missed or searched for. Immediately, Fletcher was never captured. Despite an extensive manhunt involving multiple law enforcement agencies, he seemed to vanish as completely as his victims had. The investigator told me that people like Fletcher often possess multiple identities, extensive resources, and detailed escape plans that allow them to disappear when their operations are compromised. I completed my thru hike the very next day, summiting Mount Katahdin with a Maine State Police escort for my safety. But the achievement felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of the other hikers who hadn't been as fortunate as I was. The celebration I had planned was replaced by a somber awareness, a memorial in my heart for those whose dreams had been cut short mere miles from their goal. 6 months later, an FBI agent contacted me, explaining that Fletcher appeared to be part of a larger, insidious network specializing in targeting specific types of victims in remote locations. The agent explained that successful thru hikers were particularly attractive targets because they were physically fit, mentally resilient, and possessed survival skills that would make them valuable to certain buyers. The most disturbing revelation was learning that Fletcher had been following my blog for the entire 6 months of my hike, meticulously studying my personality, my decision-making patterns, and my physical capabilities. He had been planning my abduction since I was still in Georgia, patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity when I would be most vulnerable and most isolated. I still hike, but I no longer maintain public blogs or social media accounts that could ever be used to track my movements or activities. The biggest lesson I learned is that sharing our adventures and achievements online, while seemingly innocuous, can unfortunately turn us into targets for predators who understand exactly how to weaponize our enthusiasm and pride against us. The wilderness indeed attracts people who yearn to test themselves against nature and achieve extraordinary goals. But it also, chillingly, attracts those who seek to exploit and destroy those very achievements for their own twisted profit. Understanding that stark distinction has, I believe, probably saved my life more than once since that terrifying encounter near Mount Katahdin. Sometimes I still wonder how many other hikers have crossed paths with Fletcher or individuals like him, and whether they all trusted their instincts enough to escape safely. But I never, ever wonder whether I was overreacting or being paranoid that day. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand precisely how to hunt people, who have spent months preparing for every danger imaginable except the ones that walk on two legs. The sheer vulnerability of putting your life, your journey, your very thoughts out into the digital ether is a double-edged sword. While it builds communities and inspires, it also creates a blueprint for those with malevolent intent. It's a stark reminder that even in the serene isolation of the wilderness, the connections we forge online can extend their reach in terrifying ways, leaving a permanent scar on the psyche of anyone who experiences such a profound betrayal of trust.